record. Now back to share. Okay, everyone on Zoom, can you see my presentation?
Yep, sure can.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. Good morning and happy Friday to each and every one of you. Appreciate you being on today's lecture and contract information today is going to boil around unrepresented buyers and how we navigate our conversations as listing agency or listing agent in this position. Okay. So again, my name is Simon Cazares. I am your instructor for today. And again, it's an open opportunity to ask questions, okay? This is an open opportunity to ask questions regarding anything that is pressing, things that you want to get some clarity regarding this particular topic, okay? Because again, I think it's very important for all of you to understand how to maneuver the conversations when working with someone that does not have any type of representation, meaning this is an individual buyer that does not have an agent, okay, or better known as a representation agreement, the BRBC. For everyone on Zoom, please make sure you mute yourself to only if you need to talk, then do so, but I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and anyone on the chat, okay? If you do have any questions, please just say, Simon, I have a question, or put it on the chat. I'll make sure to check on a regular basis as well. Okay. Questions, thoughts, or concerns as we go forward with the presentation? Okay, let me just do one more quick mute all, and we'll get started. So let me just admit someone. All right, so unrepresented buyers and listing listing agent's position. So what is a unrepresented buyer, right? What is a represented buyer? Okay. A unrepresented buyer is a purchaser who's acting without a real estate representation, either from a listing broker, which could be the agent who took the listing, or any other agent in the listing broker firm or any other brokerage company. Okay. That's what we call an unrepresented buyer. May a listing broker refuse to present an offer from an unrepresented buyer? Let's just say, for example, ladies and gentlemen, right? You're hosting an open house. You're the listing agent. You've got this fresh new listing, right? And you're eager and excited this weekend you're going to be doing the open house, right? What's the whole purpose and the common ground of why you want to host an open house? Right? It's to cultivate opportunities, right? It's for the opportunity for one of you as a listing agent to be able to find a buyer that's interested in submitting an offer or a possible listing out of it, right? Maybe the local neighbors are curious to see this property. They may have someone that may be interested in buying this home, or they may be thinking about selling their home and they just happen to see that this property is within their neighborhood and they're curious to know what their home is worth. And this is the reason they are going to the open house to get an idea. And that's an opportunity as a listing agent, right? As well to build that conversational piece with the potential buyer, right? To build that relationship, right? That's the whole purpose. Okay. And the reason most agents host open houses is for that opportunity, right? To be able to work with the buyer or a possible listing out of it as well. Okay. So the question here is, can a listing agent refuse to present an offer? This is someone that says, hey, and I'm going to use this notepad for, okay, so I can illustrate it, right? So I'm a consumer, right? And I have my notepad here as an example, right? Can I put something in writing on this yellow pad here on price, terms, and condition and present it to the listing agent and say, here's my offer? How many of you say, yes, this is a legitimate offer? How many say, no, that cannot possibly be a legitimate offer? Or any of you, I have no idea if that's a legitimate offer or not. So and again, I'm just opening it up for that purpose and conversational piece. How many say yes, as long as I have price, terms, and condition and a signature of the buyer, is this considered legitimate? Yes, okay. Absolutely. The answer is yeah. Okay, the answer is yes. If the buyer is sophisticated enough and knows and understands, they can literally put an offer on a yellow pad. Now, the question here is, if I'm the listing agent, right? If I'm the listing agent, can I refuse? Can I refuse to accept this to give to the seller? All right. Well, let's find out. So the rule of thumb is no, the listing broker has a duty to the seller to present all offers received, unless instructed otherwise in writing by the seller. If the listing broker is uncomfortable proceeding in a transaction with an unrepresented buyer, the listing broker should discuss this with the seller at the time of taking the listing. Possibly the listing broker is concerned about additional work, time, effort, and risk that may result if the buyer is unrepresented, or that the transaction could possibly be more difficult, especially if the buyer is unsophisticated or inexperienced. However, at the time of taking the listing, it will be unknown if the unrepresented buyer does not know what they're doing or has purchased many properties previously, or maybe an agent or broker acting on their own transaction. Interesting, right? So it really boils down to the answer is um it really boils down to this. Okay. It really depends on the circumstances in this situation surrounding this, right? But as the rule of thumb is, no, you cannot refuse an offer from anyone that submits an offer. Now we're so accustomed, right? We're so accustomed to have our car forms, right, as the standalone practice, right? Because that's how we've been accustomed for many, many years. We have an agent, we have a car form, we have a purchase agreement, and then all of the line items, right, to ultimately get them to an acceptance and open escrow, right? Well, with all of the changes that happened last year during the summer, right, that changed the way we do business now. A buyer who is responsible to pay a buyer's agent compensation, now we have to have a written agreement with the buyer, right? A BRBC, stating the fact that if the buyer wants some type of relationship or agency agreement, then they would sign an agreement with us. Okay, that's the standard practice. Now, nothing says that that buyer has to have a written agreement with us. And more so, if the buyer is a sophisticated buyer who has bought and sold, or is an investor, they can use their own type of agreements. Okay. No difference than the yellow pad. Now, I want to be crystal clear as well. If I'm a listing agent and I receive that, I'm going to present it to the seller and I'm going to tell the seller, look, here's an offer that I've received from an unrepresented buyer. Okay. Price, terms, condition, and it's signed by the buyer. So it's a legitimate agreement, right? The seller's going to say, well, what is this yellow pad here? Well, it's an offer from a buyer who's interested. I was hosting an open house and this buyer came, looked at the property, and ultimately presented me with an offer. So as my fiduciary responsibility to you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, my job is to present any and all offers that come in. Well, isn't it typically an agent that represents a buyer? Typically, yes. But with all the new changes that have occurred, a buyer can now submit an offer as an unrepresented buyer, and therefore they do not have to have a buyer's agent representing them on their behalf. So the question here, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, is what would you like me to do with this offer? Okay. Three things can happen. Okay. One, the seller can accept that offer. Two, that seller can counter that offer. And three, the seller can reject the offer. Okay. And all of those three are perfectly fine. Okay. But again, the general rule of thumb is it doesn't matter what type of offer comes in. It could be on a piece of napkin, right? And said, here. Now, are we going to take someone serious, right? If they present us with a napkin offer? Probably not. Okay. Probably not. Now, it is your job and your responsibility is to see if this buyer will ultimately want to work with the listing agent or with an agent. Now, rest assured, everyone, you can be compensated from a non-represented client. And part of our agreement when we sit down with the seller on the listing appointment, there's a section in a category that says, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I am charging you this to represent you on the marketing and ultimately to try to get you to the finish line by getting you the price you want, the terms you want, close successfully. You get your proceeds, I get paid for services rendered. Okay. That's all in the contract. There's another section on the listing agreement that says about unrepresented buyers. And that additional compensation is already on top of what you and the seller already agree to help market their property. Does that make sense? And whatever that agreement amount is, it's up to you. And it's up to the seller to come to an agreement because there is additional work that you will be responsible. Okay. And there may be a bit of a risk, but there may also be no risk on your part when working with an unrepresented buyer. And there's forms that will protect all parties on that case. Because the listing agent has a duty to the seller, right? To the seller. The seller has a fiduciary responsibility to the listing agent, right? Under no circumstances do we have any representation on a buyer, especially if the buyer does not want to sign an agreement, right? Now, can we force a buyer to sign an agreement with us? Okay. How many say yeah? How many say no? How many say I don't know? Okay. No, you can't force a buyer to work with you. Now, you have probably one of the best assets, right? Because if they're interested in buying and you're the listing agent, they may want to work with you and not work with anyone else. So there may be some benefits of working with a unrepresented buyer because you might be able to convert them into an agreement, right? What we call a buyer representation agreement, right? But that's your job and responsibility. Now, the buyer may say, look, I don't want to have any written agreement. I already know the process. I don't want to be in any agreement with you, but I like the property and I'd like to submit an offer. Okay. Two things. The buyer can submit the offer as we talked about the yellow pad, right? Or two, the agent can submit on behalf of the buyer an offer to the seller for the additional work necessary to ultimately get the deal closed, because your job and your responsibility as a listing agent is what? The responsibility to help your seller sell their home, right? And this is where that additional compensation you earn, if you do it correctly on the listing agreement, right, is for that extra work you're involved. Yes.
Question about when the buyer that piece of paper and says, okay, this is my output. Now, and I said, he or she said, okay, I want you to represent me. When do you talk to them about, about compensation, or do you talk to them at all? Or you have that already with the seller in that,
So you want to have that conversation as soon as practical, right? So if I'm hosting an open house, right, and a consumer comes in here, and one of the questions you can ask is, are you working with an agent, right? You may have your registry that says different questions. Hey, how long have you been looking for a home? How soon are you looking to buy? Have you been approved for a loan? Are you working with an agent, right? These are all questions you can ask, right, as part of the process. So if a buyer says, no, I'm not working with any real estate agents, but I'm interested in this property, okay? Well, there's two things right there. You can build that relationship by sitting with them and saying, look, we can talk about it after the open house, or if the or if the open house is not that heavy in traffic and a lot of people, maybe we can put some time to kind of just generalize what the expectations are, right? And what I do to help my clients in purchasing a home. There's two folds to that, right? One is, do we have an agreement? Because then if I have a written agreement with you, then that allows me to help you navigate the process, right, to the finish line. And then that would create ultimately a dual agency agreement. If I have a buyer and I have an agreement with this buyer, but I also represent the seller, right? And I have a listing agreement, that now creates a dual agency if I submit an offer on behalf of the buyer. Okay. Now, where it gets questionable is where the buyer does not want any representation. And based on the new changes, a buyer does not need to be represented by an agent, okay? I would encourage them the importance of why they should, okay? Because under no circumstances am I going to protect you. I don't have to. I can provide you with all the necessary paperwork and tell you X, Y, and Z, but under no circumstances do I have a fiduciary responsibility to protect you. And that's kind of how you maneuver this. Now, pros and cons, right? Because there's always going to be a risk. And that risk when it comes to unrepresented buyers is, well, I listened to Simon and Simon told me X, Y, and Z, right? And this has now put me in a position of damage, right? And that can always happen. So I have to tell you there is always going to be some type of risk, folks. Okay. Even if they do not want any type of representation. Okay. So in theory, to answer your question is, yeah, you want to sit and consult with them so you can explain to them the value proposition and why they should hire you to facilitate if this particular listing offer or any offer that they have in mind. Okay. Does that kind of clear your mind on this?
so she said, okay, so the question is, when do we start the pay, the compensation part of it? It's not free, right? Uh, By the
It
seller.
depends on the circumstances, right? If they want representation, then you want to talk about it as part of the buyer consultation agreement, right? That's why you have the BRBC form. And on the BRBC, it clearly says that the buyer is responsible to pay you compensation, whatever that agreement is between you and the buyer, right? If it's 3%, 2.5%, 2%, whatever that is, that's between you and the buyer, right? Once you establish that relationship, now that holds you accountable as the agent to represent them as a full representation. Okay. That's where you're going to be talking about the compensation. That's where you're going to be talking about the process and how we navigate the offer and submission to the seller. Okay. As soon as you have that consultation and as soon as you sign the buyer agreement, that's when you talk about compensation. Now, also, for clarity purposes, remember that if anyone other than the buyer pays you, a compensation, then that offsets the amount that the buyer is responsible to pay you compensation, right? But it all depends on what that compensation is, because if you put 3% on the BRBC, but then are asking 2.5%, right, to the listing agent, well, there's a discrepancy. You put 3 on the buy side, but you put 2.5 on the list side to ask for concessions, then the buyer would be responsible to pay you that 0.5%. Then you would have to do some type of agreement to make sure that the buyer is aware that they're going to have to come in with additional funds to pay you for the difference, okay? You always want to align the agreement you have with the BRBC to the offer submission, because on the purchase agreement under section G3, it says the amount that you're asking the seller to pay you compensation, right? So you want to have those in alignment so that way it doesn't offset one or the other. But if the buyer is still willing to pay you additional compensation, then by all means, that's a win for you, right? Because you can get some from the listing side and the seller, and also from the buyer as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the seller would know that he might be responsible for that some if it is already.
Well, yeah, when you submit the offer, you're going to provide that offer with price terms and conditions, including the compensation that you're requesting. Absolutely. Any other questions? All right, may a listing broker receive extra compensation if the listing property, if the listed property is purchased by an unrepresented buyer? Okay. Yes, under paragraph C2C of the residential listing agreement, provides for the seller to pay the listing broker additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. Paragraph 2C2 is an optional paragraph and will only apply if the box in the third column is checked at the time the listing is taken. The amount that the listing broker charges if there is an unrepresented buyer is up to the seller and the listing broker, whether 2C2 is checked, and regardless of the amount of compensation specified in C2, the listing broker is still entitled to the amount of compensation specified in paragraph C1 for representation of the seller. So meaning, you establish that relationship and they are giving you the opportunity to help them sell their home, right? So we establish what that compensation is as a seller and a listing agent, right? My job is to help you get the best price, terms, and condition. I'm going to market the property. I'm going to do open houses. I'm going to do whatever it takes to sell your home, right? We established that amount of compensation, right? That can be 3%, that can be 2%, that can be 2.5%. That depends on what you, because all commissions are all negotiable, right? We established that with the seller, right? Now, the next section talks about unrepresented, as I clearly stated earlier, right? Can you charge additional fees to the seller? The answer is yes, you can. Okay, because now it's a more workload, more paperwork, more time that you're going to be involved in. It still does not create a dual agency agreement. Okay, I want to be crystal clear with that. It doesn't establish dual agency, but what it does establish is a position that you still, as a listing agent, have a responsibility to all parties. Okay, but under no circumstances do you have any obligation in representing the buyer if the buyer chooses not to have representation. Are we clear? Okay. Your responsibility still falls under who? The seller, yes. So you're going to protect the seller. Okay. And you're going to do everything to ultimately navigate the process to get to the finish line. That's the goal of the listing agent. Okay. But additional compensation is given to you for that additional work that you are involved in. Okay. Now I get this quite often is, well, what do we charge for additional compensation if I'm requesting that from the seller for a buyer that does not have any representation? Well, I don't know. That's up to you. What do you think your time is worth to get additional compensation? Okay. That's really up to you. That could be 1%, 1.5%, 2%, 3%, whatever you can agree to and the seller's okay with. Well, can I ask 3% as well? Absolutely. You know, if the seller is willing to give you that additional, then yeah, but that's only if you represent a seller and ultimately are working with an unrepresented buyer, you'll get the additional fees, right? You're not going to get that uh, additional compensation if that buyer is already working with another agent, right? Because that agent is going to submit a request to be compensated, usually from the seller, right? So make sure you understand the elements and think, oh gosh, I scored on this, right? I got my percentage on the listing side. I got a percentage from an unrepresented buyer because I'm not represented, but another agent, but that buyer's agent is also going to request compensation too, right? So look at the bigger picture and make sure you're clear in your approach. Why might a listing broker at the time the listing is taken ask the seller for additional compensation if a buyer is unrepresented? I think I've kind of established that, but let's find out. Because an unrepresented buyer may likely make additional demands on the listing broker and would not be present if the buyer was represented, such as asking for forms, allowing access to the property, and interacting with escrow, title, and inspectors. All of these activities exposes the listing broker to additional risk, but the listing broker may need to provide some of those services to facilitate the sale of the seller's benefit and thus fulfill the listing broker's fiduciary duty to the seller. Okay. Pretty simple, right? Does everyone kind of understand the logic around a unrepresented, right? Yeah, please.
The buyer wanted to take on the pay of the decision for the statement agents. One day, what do you like? If the same thing is open, so they.
Okay, good question. So her question is why will we go in this direction, right? And the buyer go as an unrepresented, right? The reason they would go in that direction is because they do not want to pay the buyer agent compensation. Because with all of these new changes, now this is not something new, folks, okay? We've always had an established agreement with the buyer, but they were not really forcible. Well, I take it back. They were kind of loose, okay? 2-3 years ago, most agents, and I can tell you from personal experience, I wouldn't even do buyer agreements. And I'm the broker, okay? It was just a loose agreement that it was more of an honor, right? And it's a conversation I have with the buyer because back then, remember, we were guaranteed compensation automatically because when you would go on the MLS, right? On the MLS, you would scroll all the way to the bottom of the MLS and you will see how much the seller was compensating us, or in this case, the listing agent was compensating that. Because remember, back then, the agreements were as follow, that the negotiation between the seller and the listing agent also included compensation for any cooperating broker if they bring us a ready, willing, and able buyer, right? So we didn't have to really think about it because we secured our commission already. As soon as we saw a property on the MLS, we submitted our offer, and there was a form called a CBC form as well to just secure and confirm what was already established on the MLS, right? So it was slam dunk. As our offer gets accepted, we already knew we were getting 2.5, 5, or 3% of the commission. Okay. Well, that has changed, ladies and gentlemen. That is no longer part of how we do business. We don't know if the seller is or willing to pay us any compensation. Consider compensation as request of repairs now. You're in the middle of an escrow, right? And now a buyer has done all of their inspections, right? And now they're preparing the request of repairs. And part of that request of repairs is, what is the buyer requesting the seller to do? Fix it, replace it, okay, give me credit in lieu of repairs, or do a price reduction. Well, your compensation now is a negotiations tool. It's not embedded and set in stone anymore where we know exactly what our compensation is anymore. Now we have to kind of roll the dice and hope that the seller will consider our proposal, right? Price, terms, condition, and compensation to the buyer's agent. Because if the listing agent and the seller come back and says, yes to everything, but we're not paying you compensation, okay? The seller has that ability to do so. They don't have to pay you compensation. Just as much as they don't have to agree to your price. The listing is for $1 million. You make an offer for $1,000,001, okay, 100,000 above asking, the seller can still decline your offer. They can. And we have no control over it. Now, back in the days, back in Steve's times, you know, there used to be specific language that if we brought a ready, willing, and able, and if it was an offer at least at asking, we could force the seller to still sell. Remember those times?
Actually, I disagree. You're partly correct.
Yeah.
Listing office. There involved require a seller to sell a home to a buyer or even higher than their list price. However, a listing office was able to then, if a seller declined to close an escrow to with a ready, willing, and able buyer and an offer that was at least full price. The listing office was able to sue for their commission. Okay, because they brought a ready, willing, and able buyer. That was what the listing contract requires. Okay.
Yeah.
And if the seller, you know, even contributes to say close as a result of their actions. Okay, listing office then is not the buying office nor the buyer.
Yeah.
There's no contractual obligation to that.
Right.
Okay, so.
Yeah. And that was a long, long, long time ago, folks. Okay. Those times are definitely gone. Yeah. I remember too, one thing that I do miss was there was a provision on the purchase agreement that allowed us to release a contingency. And you know, the contingencies were like 2 days or when the notice to perform, right? And then you would send the notice to perform, they would have 48 hours to release that a contingency. Well, a buyer agent had the ability to extend that time. I think it was already embedded 5 days or something that we could have pushed it for a longer time. So it would upset so many listing agents. It's like, I have that provision that says we have additional time to release that as a condition. Yeah, that was, but they,
You don't get two more.
that's right. Yeah. All right, may a seller refuse to receive offers from an unrepresented buyer, right? We talked about this listing agent, now we talk about the seller, right? So yes, but there is a little incentive for a seller to do so. The offer may be professionally prepared by an experienced investor or poorly prepared by a novice purchaser. It is mostly likely in the seller's best interest to receive all offers, even those from an unrepresented buyer, and then decide how to respond, if at all, to such offer on their merit, including taking the account that the buyer is unrepresented. Okay, and that's part of the part 2 of the presentation. So kind of it's pretty self-explanatory, right? Any and all offers, including a yellow pad, is considered an offer, right? As long as there's price, terms, and consideration in a signature, an initial saying that the buyer is interested, they do not have to use the CAR forms, okay? Now, there's a lot of generic forms that you can also populate. There's a lot of investors that use generic offers as well. Now, I want to also caution you as a licensed agent, right? You always want to use our forms because there's a lot of specific language that protects all parties, including the agents involved. Because a lot of the disclaimers on these forms says that the agents have, you know, so much knowledge, but they're not experts in anything else, right? This is why it's always good to use our forms. But again, if the seller says, I'm okay with that yellow pad, you know, I don't see any issues, then you run with it. But I would have the conversation and says, look, there's pros and cons regarding this. There's no language about contingencies and removals and all that. So a buyer can be able to exit out of this if we have no accountability that we can hold or any breach. This is why these forms are so specific that has all of the answers to all of your questions if you read these contracts. Yes.
So let's say that they did. No. Encourage the buyer to. Partnership, or
Absolutely. So to answer your question, yeah, part of the counter says that we're going to use the California Association of Realtors purchase agreement, and we're just going to add all of the additional terms that you have on your yellow pad into and incorporate into the purchase agreement. But it also provides the buyer with peace of mind that they have timelines that they have to meet, requirements that they need to do, and ultimately it sets the tone on the provisions to get the deal to the finish line. So yeah, absolutely. You know, if I was a listing agent, will take that into consideration, but I would put a counter offer and saying, we're going to utilize the purchase agreement. So here's the paperwork. And you as an agent can also provide, you know, all of the information and add this to the buyer, even though you're not representing the buyer. You can do the work. This is why you get paid additional percentage to do that additional work for a unrepresented buyer. Okay, so adding the additional language into the purchase agreement is something that you can do. Okay, good question. Any other questions?
Hi,
Okay.
Simon, this is Alon, KW Luxury.
Yes.
How are you?
Good,
TGIF,
my friend. How are
everybody.
you? Good, good
Doing
to hear from
wonderful.
you. Yes, sir.
Always love you to listen to your classes. Always learning new things.
Thank you.
I just had a quick question. So if the seller decides to go with an unorthodox type paperwork in a form of an offer that is other than car, would our E&O insurance still cover us?
Absolutely. Yeah. The E&O insurance, as long as you have a written agreement with the seller, yeah, you're still protected. You have a bona fide agreement, so therefore you're still protected under the umbrella of the E&O insurance. Even though you may not have a traditional document in place, you're still covered under our E&O insurance.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. I think one way to educate our sellers is to let them know also that hey, as your listing agent, I'm not very familiar with this paperwork that's submitted in a way in an offer other than the car forms. Therefore, if you do decide to go ahead with it, I'm not going to have the same experience in protecting your interest, and maybe they get the seller's attention that way.
Yeah, 100%. And just to add to that, the common practice, right, is, you're trying to protect the buyer too, right? Because we don't want to be caught up on a litigation. We don't want to be caught up in a lawsuit, right? Because we should have known better, right? I would encourage all of you, right, to have the conversation with the buyer and says, look, we'll take your yellow pad into consideration offer, right? But I think for peace of mind for all parties in your best interest, even though I'm not representing you, let's utilize the form that has specific language that protects you, protects the seller, protects the agent involved in this transaction.
Yeah,
So I
thank you.
definitely, that'll just give you that upper advantage and that additional peace of mind too, that, you're at least providing additional support to navigate that. Even though, again, just to be clear, you're not giving any representation to the buyer if they choose not to. Now, the ultimate goal is have an agreement in place because now you can maneuver that. But that in itself is another risk, right? When it comes to dual agencies, how can you possibly represent two individuals, two parties, right? A buyer and a seller. Now, if the transaction goes as smooth as possible, fantastic, great, congratulations. But it's at the moment that it goes sideways, that's when it gets a little tricky because then the buyer or the seller is going to say, Well, Simon, how do you believe you have my best interest when you are also trying to protect the buyer, or vice versa, protect the seller, right? So it can be a little bit tricky to maneuver that. Yeah. But it's again, experience, and also make sure you bring it to our attention so we can help you navigate that, because again, that's where we see a lot of issues and disputes on dual agency. And we're one of the states that still allows dual agency, okay? And dual agency in a lot of states are not allowed anymore, okay? Now, dual agency also is one agent representing both buyer and seller. Dual agency is also considered two agents in the same brokerage representing one or the other buyer seller in this case. All right, let's continue. If a listing broker charges the seller an additional fee if a buyer is unrepresented, does that make the listing broker a dual agency? All right. No. An agency is a consensual relationship that requires mutual agreement for the agent to represent the principal. The fact that the seller is paying the listing broker extra or not for a transaction involving an unrepresented buyer does not in and of itself create an agency relationship between the listing broker and the buyer. Okay, so we're all established that, right? Just because I am talking to an unrepresented buyer doesn't create dual agency, okay? The only way that creates dual agency is if I have a written agreement with a buyer and the buyer signs this agreement establishing my duty to the buyer and my duty to the seller, then it establishes dual agency agreement. All good on that? Okay. If a listing broker gives an unrepresented buyer a blank offer, what else should the broker do or not do? The broker should provide the buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement, CAR form BNA. BNA. The broker should not discuss terms with or help the unrepresented buyer complete the offer. In all further communications with the unrepresented buyer, the broker should remind the buyer that the broker is acting in the capacity as the seller's broker only and should refer to the buyer to the previous provided BNA form, okay? Remember, we don't have an agreement with the buyer, so therefore we don't have a responsibility. But you do have a responsibility to ultimately help navigate the process with the seller, right? And if this is the only offer you have with someone that is not being represented by an agent, right? And the buyer does not want to establish an agreement with you and have you and them sign a buyer representation agreement, you still have a responsibility, okay, to navigate and ultimately guide the initial process, right? But under no circumstances do you have an agreement or a fiduciary responsibility to the buyer. Does that make sense? Okay. How should a seller respond to an offer written by an unrepresented buyer? The offer should be evaluated on its own merit by considering the offer's terms and presentation. A relevant factor could include the fact that the buyer is unrepresented. The seller could decide to, 1, not respond at all, 2, reject the buyer's offer, 3, accept the buyer's offer, or 4, issue a counter to the buyer's offer if the buyer offer is poorly written or does not contain terms approved by the seller. It may be best in the counteroffer to reject the buyer's offer in its entirety and refer to and include with the counteroffer a new purchase offer prepared by the listing broker on behalf of the seller with terms acceptable to the seller. Make sense? Pretty self-explanatory, right? I cannot get any clearer on this. Okay. And it goes back to the philosophy of the yellow pen. Okay. I like it, I don't like it, right? Because again, it establishes a position of interest, right? And with all of the new changes, ladies and gentlemen, you can, present an offer. I can. Okay, let's just say that Steve, as the listing agent, I'm a sophisticated buyer, right? And I know ins and outs. I could present an offer, okay, to Steve on a yellow pad. And I can say the following: the date, my price, my terms, my conditions, sign it, and then said, Mr. Gottlieb, here's a proposed offer. Can you please present it to the seller? Okay. And based on this, the three components is he has a fiduciary responsibility to present it, right? Now, there's alternatives to this. And this is why on your listing presentation, when you're sitting with the seller before it even goes on the market, is to establish the do's and don'ts of it unrepresented, because that may be the case. So when I'm sitting and talking to the listing with the seller, I'm going to set the tone and the expectation. Mr. Mrs. Seller, by the way, we may have a buyer who is not being represented by anyone, and they may submit an offer. And that offer may not be in a traditional car form. They can use a scratch paper, a napkin, or a yellow pad to submit an offer. Are you okay with that? Right? The seller's going to say, well, what are the pros and cons to that? Would it benefit me? Well, it depends. It does and it doesn't. One, we have a legitimate offer, but it doesn't establish conditions here to protect all parties. Oh, I don't want that. So I want you to make sure that they use a car form. Wonderful. I just need that in writing, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. As part of the listing agreement, you're going to include that any offers on an unrepresented must use a car forms. Okay? That establishes the written agreement that you have with the seller. So now that establishes your responsibility. So if an offer of Simon goes to Steve, right? He's immediately going to say, thank you very much. We're going to propose a counteroffer and establish what we want as part of the terms.
And you can put that in the listing agreement. Like you did short term.
That's right.
Listing agreement.
That's right. Make sense?
If you say it's what you then would in that listing,
I'm sorry, say again?
I would accept that piece of paper. What you gotta look in there.
So the question is, if the seller is okay receiving an offer on a yellow pad, then it's okay. I would still encourage the seller to please double, not double, but understand the consequences and the risk involved, right?
The writing too, that you accept that.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because he's going to have to sign that yellow pad saying, I agree to the terms, or have an addendum added to it that says that we accept the terms of the buyer's agreement. Okay. That's right. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I would probably say this is where you need to put your foot down and say, look, to protect all parties, I think it's just best for all interests, especially you, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Let's counter utilizing our forms, because that exposes so many things. Then what's going to happen is the seller is going to be pissed if this buyer backs out of the deal in 20, 25 days, because they had the loophole that didn't give us written instructions on conditions, timelines to release contingencies, and all that fun stuff. Then who do you think they're going to blame? They're going to blame the listing agent. Well, Simon, you should have had my back on this. Well, I did, but you still wanted to go in the direction of me. This is why you want to set the tone, as Steve says, is usually they will listen to you, because all you're doing is protecting their best interest. Okay. Okay, if the listing agent or another agent in the same brokerage company at the listing, company as the listing agent prepares an offer for the buyer, will that buyer represented by the brokerage company? If the agent for the brokerage company has previously obtained a buyer signature on a buyer representation agreement, better known as the BRBC, then the buyer is represented and the brokerage company will be considered due agent. If the buyer has not signed a buyer representation agreement either previously or prior to or concurrently with the signed offer, then an agency, if any, will be determined by the circumstances. If the agent prepared the offer merely provides the buyer with a blank form and also provides the buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement, and the agency confirmation paragraph in the offer identifies the listing broker as the sales agent only, the agency should be avoided and the buyer will be unrepresented. However, if the agent prepares the offer, discusses terms with the buyer, and assists the buyer in completing the offer, then the buyer could believe that the agent was acting on the buyer's behalf and that the agent could be deemed to represent the buyer. The listing broker company will then be considered a dual agent in the transaction when the agent fails to obtain the buyer's signature on a buyer representation agreement. The broker and specific the licensee will be entitled to compensation from the buyer for the service rendered. The brokerage will be a gratuity agent with the same responsibility and liability to the buyer as a paid agent without the benefit of compensation. The brokerage company will also not be entitled to additional compensation from the seller for having an unrepresented buyer. So be advised, folks, okay? So the situation that can occur, right, is, and this is why it's so important, put it in writing, okay? You're the listing agent. Do not leave the compensation category blank, okay? And explain, most of the time, you're not going to represent the buyer, most of the time, right? So, but in case it does, and we have no other offer, this is why I'm charging additional fees to represent a unrepresented buyer. So make sure you put some type of compensation, because if you don't, you're working for free, technically speaking. You're still going to be compensated, folks, on the listing, right? The 2.5%, the 3%, you're still going to get paid on that, but you're not going to get paid additional work that now establishes you in navigating a buyer who is not being represented. Okay. And if you're okay with it, then you're okay with it. Okay. But also remember this, due agency, right? Is two agents, right? Under the same brokerage. Now, if a buyer is represented by an agent, we need to establish that they should have a buyer representation agreement, right? Better known as the BRBC, right? So in theory, in the mind of the seller and the listing agent is that the buyer is responsible to pay the buyer's agent compensation. And this is why it's important for you to establish that relationship too, when you sit and consult with the buyers to find out, do they have the means to pay me? Do they have enough for a down payment? Do they have enough for a closing cost? Do they have enough to pay me a commission of a minimum 2.5, right? And you can incorporate that conversation and also speak on it when speaking with a lender. Please make sure to add the additional 1, 2, 2.5, or 3%. So that way the buyer, full transparency, knows exactly what they're going to need to bring to the table to make this deal work, which includes your compensation. A lot of buyers may have the means to. They just choose not to because in their mind, traditionally speaking, it's always been the seller that pays us compensation. And I get it. But that's not the norm anymore. The new norm is now the buyer is responsible, with the hope that when we submit an offer, the seller is willing to compensate us. And then that would credit us or offset the cost that the buyer is obligated to pay us. Does that make sense? Okay. I think this is the last slide, but I could be wrong. Yep, it is our last slide. Let me look at some of the comments or questions we have, and then we should be done. All right, so is it good script to use for unrepresented buyers in case we have additional compensation agreements with the seller to the buyer? If you do not let me represent you, the seller will now have to pay additional compensation. This would mean that the seller will be less willing to negotiate the price of the property. Thus, you will be paying a higher price for the property itself, most likely. Yeah, I mean, that's a great combo conversation to have, because remember, the essence is most buyers that do not want to work with an agent is because they don't want to pay compensation. But if you can really sell them on the value and the goods of why it's always best to have a licensed, experienced agent, is to protect you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. That's my number one priority, and because of that, I'm asking for compensations for services rendered, right? Which in the past, I get it, folks, it's always been that the seller pays us, right? Well, those times have changed now. That is not part of the initial process. We're hoping in most cases, we're still seeing sellers do pay compensation. So that's a good thing. But you may have a percentage that say, nope, we're not gonna pay. Then what? Then what do you do, right? Well, the buyer has to make an ultimate decision there, right? To either rescind their offer, ask for different amounts, different terms, or decide, let's go find another property that is willing to pay me compensation. Now, on the MLS too, folks, there's a section where you can see if they are paying concession, either yes, no. If you see yes, then great. You already know that the seller is flexible in paying. If it says no, does that mean no? Yeah, that means no. But it doesn't mean that you cannot still try to shoot for the best and still, submit a request. You just never know. Maybe your price, the terms of the condition may be favorable to the seller, and they may say, look, they're offering that it's a great offer, they're paying above asking, I'm willing to pay compensation for it. So even though the MLS may say no, still submit your request. If it's left blank, right, whereas there's no or yes to the compensation, that to me is neutral. That means still submit. Okay, that's again rolling the dice that the seller is willing to pay compensation. All right, the next one is the seller. The seller then asks what challenges and what the risk is accepting a napkin offer. Well, there's a lot of challenges, and I think I've addressed that, Lily, is basically I wouldn't take a napkin as a way of doing so, right? I'm just using it as an illustration, but if someone provides me with a napkin offer, I'm not going to take it serious. Okay? I'm not going to take it serious. Now, it's going to be funny is that if they do say, I want you to present this to the seller, right? What's your take on that? Okay? A piece of napkin and it has price terms and conditions, right? Well, again, folks, you got to use common sense, right? Something like that, you're probably going to say, unfortunately, this doesn't look legitimate. So therefore, if you're serious, I can help you. If you're serious, use a generic offer. But in theory, that's kind of, an unrepresented buyer. They can use a napkin as a way of submitting an offer. Now, for face value, obviously, it's not, in my opinion, someone that's serious, right? Because someone that takes this proposed offer, they're going to put time, effort in presenting a legitimate offer, right? That says, look, here's an offer that we'd like for you to present to the seller. Okay. All right. And do we have another question? Since we do not have an agreement with the unrepresented buyer, do we have it to discuss how much the additional compensation is? No. So this is between the seller and you. If you've already agreed and established what that compensation is, then no, the establishment is, because the unrepresented buyer is not going to pay you compensation. You're getting compensation from the seller, so therefore you do not have to have the conversation with the buyer. The only time you're going to have a conversation about compensation is if you are asking the buyer to have an agreement with you in writing, a BRBC. Then that's where you're going to put the compensation. All righty, cool. Well, that concludes our lecture today. Any final questions before we close out? I am giving you 1 minute back of your time. I appreciate you all. Have a wonderful week and be safe out there. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Also, a quick reminder, Mr. Steve Gottlieb has his Thursday, 6 p.m. Contract Q&A that I would encourage all of you to jump on as well. Steve has a wealth of knowledge, many years of experience, and does a fantastic job in supporting our agents. With that being said, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day and be safe out there.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.